And it gives me a great pleasure to hand over to Tully Barnett. Thank you, Tully.
Thank you. Another task at hand now to try and wrap up something that is so incredibly diverse and rich and deep and will have us thinking for a long time. But I'll just start by saying that I run a research centre called Assemblage Centre for Creative Arts with a great team of people here in the college, and we've got a lot of themes that we work towards that cover so many of the issues that we've discussed today. But I also have some research areas, one of which is digital humanities, and this is one of the ways that I know Jeff and Mitchell and other people that are in the audience around thinking about how do we use computational tools in order to look at humanities research in a different way and give us different kinds of answers, and also a cultural policy project where I'm always thinking about how do we understand the value of arts and culture beyond the economic data, beyond the spillover effects, etc. And last night in our keynote from TUGLO, we saw those things come together in really interesting and productive ways. So one of the things that keeps coming up over the last night and today is this idea of measuring the immeasurable. And I think that might be the one standalone single challenge that we have to take away from these presentations that we've experienced, is this idea of how do we begin to do that? One, by acknowledging that not everything can be measured and communicated through measurement, or not everything can be understood when it is measured, or communicated in ways that go in the same directions and have the result that we want. But when I get up to talk about this project around how do we understand the value of arts and culture, one of the stories that I always tell is about the time that I was tasked with training a group of tourism students to conduct a evaluation methodology, a value exercise using tablets and a willingness to pay contingent value methodology to go out to the Adelaide Festival. We were in a group and approach people and ask them how do they understand the value of the experience that they've just had. So there were lots of instances of this. Sometimes we were on the street doing non-user surveys, which is people that had never attended the festival or had not attended it this year. Sometimes we were out at the free concert that was, I can't remember who it was that year, but Paul Kelly, I think, may have been one of them, a free concert by the Rotunda. But the one that sticks in my mind is the time that we were standing outside the Adelaide Festival surveying people who were coming out of an Archie Roach concert. And they were coming out of the concert, some people with tears streaming down their faces because he'd just finished with They Took the Children Away. What an emotional experience. And I'm standing there with a tablet and a team of people with tablets saying, now can you tell me how much you'd be willing to pay and still feel that you got value for money from this experience? Right? So that tells us something about measuring the unmeasurable and the work that measuring can do and when it's right for that work of measuring to do. And so what we heard this morning so we've had 3 theme sessions today, so I'll just remind you what they were. So the theme of data legacies, the theme of climate data, the theme of location data, and then our lightning talks just now, which I'll also come to in a moment. But all of those in different ways ask us to think about what are our obligations with this data. And I wanted to ask Sean, but come on, we're told all the time that the creative work is the skill of the future, because it's the one thing that can't be changed by or can't be incorporated into artificial intelligence. So of course, that's the project that he had to go straight to and think about, well, can we upend that? And somebody asked me how do we and it came up last night in our discussion with T, where is the art in this experience? How do we understand what that AI interaction with creative writing and what it produces, and where it does or does not become understandable as something that is art? And my response was that maybe that's not where the art is. Maybe the art is to be found in the collaboration before the thing actually is produced, and what we do with that information, what we do with that experiment, and what we do with ourselves in relation to the collaborative projects. So obligations come up everywhere here, right? And so T's talk was really about, the role of the art sector in being able to take that role in working with this world the work that the world needs us to be doing right now, right? And through that, to be thinking around what role the digital plays in supporting that work, that important work that the world needs us to do right now. And so that comes back to obligations as well. And in our first session this morning on data legacy, the takeaway message that I got from that, as I said in my question, was about the way that surveillance or that seeing goes in both directions. And so now we've got proliferated obligations that work together in entanglements to create superset obligations, perhaps, and a constant requirement to be on the ball, to be agile, to be looking back whenever we can, to be looking back, to be assessing. And so that requires a whole range of skills and literacies. And so the question that I would have asked to Jeff and Mitchell is around, when we're dealing with climate data, we're dealing with the need for data literacies, but we're also dealing with the need for climate literacies. And are these literacies always the same? Are they sometimes the same? Are there tensions between them? And I think we saw that in Tully's talk with the weavings, when she said that we only see it in its real full state when we pull back. And so that pulling back and honing in is a skill set in itself, to be able to slip between these modes of being in order to be able to collect, operationalise, communicate, and make that change, and also to make the space for that change in the world that we need going forward. More things to say. Just said those things. So many notes, and that's the problem with this, is that you go away with so many brilliant, wonderful notes. So thinking through issues like that paradox of the archive that Nat talked about this morning, Natalie Harkin talked about this morning, the paradox of data, that paradox of going in and sitting with the feelings and discomfort in some instances, but also the love. And we've been talking a little about throughout the day in little conversation groups around the materiality of that as well, the sound of it, even the sound of the archive, the feel of the archive, the smell of the archive, and questions around the digital archives and the kinds of senses that they have. That's another big thing that came out of Tully's talk, was sensing and making sense of the data as two very different things. And so embodying, having an embodied relationship to that data, even when it's in its digital environment, is really important. So we heard a lot about that looking back to the sources of the data. So in the Countess report, that important continuing work that continues to collect its own data around who is being represented in our galleries and museum systems, and how they, in our institutions, and how they're being represented, and yet how that is a very hands-on task. We heard it's a manual data collection, and we heard about how that data is may or may not connect to other forms of data that we have about the arts and culture sector, such as the experience of artists, and a reference was made to David Throsby's work, which really points to the difficult conditions of the artistic career that pervade. And if you are on Twitter, you will see that at the moment we're getting a lot of interesting posts by artists who are sharing their employment data, their income for the tax year that has just ended, and really stepping through for us what a career in the arts looks like. And so for Throsby to collect that data about the artists' employment situations, and then for the Countess reports to show us how that then how that small amount of paid work is reflected in our institutions and on our walls. And so that creates another kind of doubling and tension there between kinds of data that we have access to and what we do with it. Another thing that came through for me was Aidan's discussion about how sometimes he said, I'll finish the work and then keep learning about it. So that goes beyond coincidence into the realm of a deeper and more fulfilling connection. And so, lots of thinking there about how the work of artists and the work of people who write about artists connects up to a kind of larger kind of imaginary for which data is one component of it, but that the connection between those elements of imaginary. And again, I'm reminded of somebody today who said that, it was Ian, I think, that it's the gap, Ian MacArthur, that there's gaps, it's the gaps between the nodes in the network where the sounds of the data leap out of the work and grab you, the spaces in between the links and the nodes. And the spaces aren't empty, he said, they're overflowing. And another thing that really stuck with me was the comment about the pelican history, but I can't remember who talked about. That was Judy, the pelican history. Oh, right, great. Oh, well, I think there is a series called The Pelican. I think I've even have anyway, so the penguin history. Okay, so thinking then about how what work needs to be done in order to take something that is of that magnitude and make it concise to fit into a penguin history, which is perhaps the point that Judy was making. What gets left out when you are making a single volume history? But the Pelican books, they're the ones that expand out. There's volume 1, volume 2, volume 7, volume 13. And is that where we start to think about that whiplash that I asked in my question around honing in and pulling out and learning to be comfortable with that whiplash, to be able to respond in both modes? We heard a lot about the aesthetics of climate data rendered into artistic form, and thinking about, and another thing that Tully said in relation to that was, I don't think of the datascapes as visualizations. They are another kind of narrative. And that's another thing that draws together so many of the presentations that we've had today, which is about sometimes the data is a jumping off point between, for telling new stories out of things that aren't visible when you're looking in that sequential way. And another story that I tell about my digital humanities work is that I got into the field of digital humanities because I was writing a thesis about representations of information technology in contemporary literary fiction, and somebody sent me one of my texts, Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum, as a text file, and I put it into a word cloud generator, and new things jumped out at me that I hadn't seen when I'd read that 800 or 900 page novel from page 1 to page 800 4 or 5 times. I'd read it so many times in order to be able to write about it. But when I put it into a word cloud generator, new knowledge emerged that I hadn't been able to see with my sequential linear reading brain. And so telling those new stories out of that data is something that is an opportunity, right? To perhaps not to think about them just as visualizations which represent the data in a new way, but as either new narratives or portals towards the new narratives. And so, and then Tully also said something about the way that the individual experience of climate change doesn't show up when you're looking at it in your own personal contained thinking space, but rather and pointing out the fact that all of our experiences of climate is so vastly different, but rather when we join together. So that data then is a new kind of collectivism, a new kind of coming together to not tell one story that obliterates the other stories, but in that finely woven year-on-year data of Tully Weinberg's representation of climate data in weaving, we see every year, but we see it together. And so then just finally to say, all of these works, all of these ideas, all of these new ways of thinking, new opportunities, new obligations, old obligations rendered anew, are visible in the Data Imaginary Fear and Fantasies exhibition that I'm hoping the people in the room will come and see in a moment out at FUMA, but also can be engaged with in multiple ways on the website, in the catalogue book that contains numerous thinkings, workings with, considerations about the issues that we've been discussing over the last couple of days. But also that the people who are engaging with these concepts, whether it's through these talks, through the exhibition, through the artworks, through the works of the artists that came together for this exhibition, my hope is that you will take these obligations, new ways of thinking, new questions out into your everyday interactions with data, from the moment that you get up to the moment that you go to bed. What is the data that you're leaving? And there are works in FUMA that will make new questions about this as well that you can come and see. Who is surveilling your data? Whose data are you surveilling? And what are your obligations in relation to that? And finally, to say, we have to get comfortable with that discomfort that goes along with reaching around the edges of new conversations, new narratives, and new interactions between old narratives, new data, new visual arts methods for communicating that, new ways of talking about that art, and new ways of building a sense of political activism that is drawn out of all of this work, that incorporates the aesthetic, incorporates art as a mode of telling stories, that incorporates new notions of value that will enable us to communicate that the importance of this work, but also the capacity to make that political change on the political level. And finally, to say that I'm sure there's a final, when Mitchell and Jeff I think it was Jeff was talking about the gloominess of data and when is the right time to tell the story of the climate 2050. Is it now? Is it not now? That demonstrates an agency around the deployment of data and its narratives that may align with our human needs on a particular case-by-case basis, moment-by-moment situation where we can be thinking about the data that we need in order to create the stories that tell the future, that speak the future into being that we want to exist within, as well as the stories that we need to create change using the gloomy narratives when we need to do that. I will finish there.
Thank you, Tully. That was a big ask. There were so many things to pull together. You've once again demonstrated your skill in being able to meld those different ideas into a cohesive narrative. Thank you so much. I am going to put a plug in for the Data Imaginary catalogue. It is available for purchase at FUMA, but I'm sure if you look on the Griffith Uni website, you'll be able to purchase it through there. Angela is nodding, so I think that's a yes. That really has some excellent essays in it that, expand on some of the works in the show. So I want to commend that to you as one of my departing statements. I also want to acknowledge and thank particularly all the presenters who came on board for this 2 days of proceedings. It's not easy to kind of align everybody's schedules, but thanks so much to everybody who we managed to get here either in person or online. It was, I think we'll all agree, it was a very stimulating symposium. I want to acknowledge, of course, T. Uglo, our keynote speaker last night. I think that with that talk, the scene was really set for the conversations that we had today. I want to particularly acknowledge the curatorium behind the exhibition, Angela Goddard, who's in the room from Griffith University Art Museum, Associate Professor Catherine Moline from the University of New South Wales, Associate Professor Beck Davis, also in the room from Australian National University, and Amanda Heyman and Troy Casey from Black Lash Creative. Not only did they do just such a fantastic job in bringing the exhibition together, but also, of course, have so generously contributed to this event, and, of course, have been the chairs of the sessions today. Just a quick note of thanks to our team at Scene Change. You've done a great job. There was a lot to juggle with all that AV and sound, so thank you very much. And finally, Liz has actually left the room, so I'll have to repeat this. But really, the nuts and bolts of this were all managed by Liz Grand-Mason, who brought really boundless energy and commitment to the delivery of the proceedings, and none of this would have been possible without her. So thank you, Liz, and I'll make sure that I repeat that to you in person. And so finally, just a thanks to you all here in the room and any of you who may still be online. It's really been a great honour to be able to present this today. Thank you very much.